In the autumn of 1918, deep in the Argonne forest of France, Major Charles Whittlesey led his battalion into what would become one of the most harrowing episodes of World War I. The 77th Division, composed largely of immigrants and working-class men from New York City, had been thrust into the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, the final Allied push to break German lines. These were not professional soldiers. They were clerks, tailors, bartenders, and laborers who had answered their country's call. Among them were men who still spoke with thick accents from their homelands, Jews fleeing persecution, Italians seeking new lives, Irishmen escaping poverty. They had trained together, suffered together, and now they would endure together what the army would later call impossible odds. The mission seemed straightforward enough on paper. Whittlesey's battalion would advance through a ravine in the dense forest, pushing forward to break through German positions and create a gap in enemy lines. Intelligence suggested the Germans were retreating, that resistance would be minimal. On October 2, 1918, approximately 600 men from the 308th Infantry Regiment, along with elements from other units, moved forward into the thick woodland. The forest itself was a nightmare landscape, scarred by years of warfare, with splintered trees reaching toward gray skies like skeletal fingers. Shell craters pocked the earth, filled with stagnant water and the detritus of previous battles. Visibility was poor, communication would prove nearly impossible, and every shadow could hide death. By late afternoon, Whittlesey's men had advanced nearly a mile beyond their designated position. They had pushed deeper into enemy territory than any other American unit in that sector, believing they were being supported on their flanks by other battalions. But those supporting units had been forced back by fierce German resistance. The Americans didn't know this. They had no way of knowing that they were now completely isolated, a small island of doughboys surrounded by an ocean of German soldiers. When darkness fell on that first night, the men dug shallow foxholes in the hillside overlooking a small ravine, establishing a defensive perimeter roughly 300 yards long and 60 yards wide. They had some ammunition, limited rations, and no idea that their ordeal was just beginning. The Germans discovered their position quickly. At dawn on October 3rd, the forest erupted with the crack of rifle fire and the distinctive rattle of machine guns. German forces, estimated at around 5,000 men, had completely encircled the American position. The enemy held the high ground on three sides, turning the ravine into a killing zone. Any movement during daylight invited immediate fire. The Germans were methodical and patient, content to wait and let hunger, thirst, and constant bombardment do their work. They had mortars, artillery, machine gun nests positioned with overlapping fields of fire, and snipers who could pick off anyone foolish enough to expose themselves for more than a few seconds. Whittlesey, a tall, lean lawyer from Massachusetts with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet intensity, understood their situation immediately. He sent runners back through the forest to re-establish contact with American lines, to get reinforcements, to arrange for supplies. Most of these runners never made it. They were cut down by machine gun fire, captured, or simply disappeared into the churning chaos of no man's land. One runner, Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, managed to slip through German lines after an agonizing journey through shell holes and barbed wire, bringing word of the battalion's desperate situation to headquarters. But relief would not come quickly, and Whittlesey knew it. The days blurred together into an endless nightmare of hunger, thirst, and terror. The men had entered the forest with only one day's rations, expecting to be resupplied quickly. By the second day, they were already dividing their meager supplies, rationing every crumb. By the third day, there was nothing left. Some men chewed on tree bark, others ate leaves or tried to find edible roots in the forest floor. The creek at the bottom of the ravine offered water, but reaching it meant certain death. German machine gunners had it zeroed in, and bodies of men who had tried to fill canteens lay sprawled on its banks, a grim warning to anyone else who might be thirsty enough to try. The wounded presented an impossible moral calculus. Without medical supplies, without morphine, without even bandages after the first day, the medical officers could do little but watch men die slowly. Screams of the injured filled the forest day and night, a constant psychological assault on those still able to fight. Some wounds were catastrophic, caused by high explosive shells that tore through human flesh like paper. Others were smaller but no less deadly, infections setting in quickly in the filthy conditions. The medics worked tirelessly, using strips torn from their own uniforms to bind wounds, but it was never enough. Men died calling for their mothers, for their wives, for water that would never come. On the fourth day, something happened that seemed impossible to comprehend. American artillery began falling on their position. Shells screamed down from the sky, erupting in geysers of earth and shrapnel among the very men they were supposed to protect. Whittlesey's radio operator had been killed on the first day, and all attempts to signal their position to American artillery spotters had failed. Now their own guns were killing them. Men who had survived German bullets and shells were torn apart by American ordnance. The cruel irony was almost too much to bear. Whittlesey desperately tried to send messages via carrier pigeon, the only communication method left to him. Several pigeons were released, but whether they made it back to American lines, no one knew. Finally, Whittlesey released his last pigeon, a bird named Cher. He attached a desperate message to its leg. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cher took flight, and German soldiers immediately began shooting at it. The bird was hit, losing an eye and suffering a chest wound, one leg nearly severed. But somehow, miraculously, it kept flying. It traveled 25 miles back to division headquarters in just 25 minutes, delivering the message that finally stopped the friendly fire. That pigeon would later receive France's Croix de Guerre for its heroism, a rare honor for an animal. But for the men in that ravine, it was nothing short of salvation from a particularly cruel form of death. The German commanders, recognizing that direct assault would be too costly against Duggan Americans, tried a different tactic. They sent a captured American soldier, blinded and wounded, stumbling into the perimeter with a message. The Germans demanded surrender, promising good treatment as prisoners of war if the Americans laid down their arms. They suggested that continuing to resist was pointless, that no relief was coming, that the men would die for nothing. Whittlesey read the message and gave his response in 5 words that would become legend. "Go to hell." He refused even to dignify the German ultimatum with a formal reply. His men, starving and exhausted, somehow found the strength to agree. There would be no surrender. But the truth was that their situation was becoming untenable. By the 5th day, October 7th, ammunition was nearly exhausted. The able-bodied men who could still fight were down to a handful of bullets each. The wounded outnumbered the healthy. Disease was spreading through the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Shell shock had reduced some men to catatonic states, staring blankly at nothing while the battle raged around them. Whittlesey himself was wounded, though he refused to acknowledge it or seek treatment. Captain George McMurtry, his second-in-command, had been wounded several times but continued to move among the men, offering encouragement, helping the medics, maintaining some semblance of order in the chaos. What kept them going was something difficult to quantify or explain. It was partly leadership, certainly. Whittlesey and McMurtry led by example, sharing every hardship with their men, refusing special treatment, maintaining discipline even as their world collapsed around them. But it was more than that. These men, many of them new to America, many of them looked down upon by native-born Americans as inferior immigrants, had something to prove. They would not break. They would not surrender. They would show that they were worthy of the uniform they wore, that their lives had meaning, that their sacrifice would matter. The Germans made several direct assaults on the position during those 5 days, hoping to overrun the Americans before relief could arrive. Each time, the defenders drove them back with rifle fire, grenades, and in close quarters, bayonets and rifle butts. Bodies piled up on the approaches to the American position. The Germans had expected the isolated battalion to surrender quickly once they realized help wasn't coming. But these New Yorkers, these sons of immigrants, these men who had been given every reason to feel like outsiders in their own country, refused to give up. They held the line not because they had hope of survival, but because surrendering was unthinkable. On the afternoon of October 7th, men in the perimeter began to hear something new. The sound of artillery, but moving toward them, not falling on them. American voices shouting in the forest, getting closer. The 77th Division had finally broken through German lines in a coordinated assault, pushing toward the trapped battalion. German forces, realizing they were about to be surrounded themselves, began withdrawing. The siege was ending. When the relief force finally reached Whittlesey's position, they were unprepared for what they found. Of the approximately 600 men who had entered the forest 5 days earlier, only 194 were able to walk out under their own power. The survivors were hollow-eyed specters, barely recognizable as human beings. They had lost an average of 30 pounds each. Many were wounded. All were traumatized. They had held their position not through superior firepower or tactical genius, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to surrender. The ground around their perimeter was carpeted with spent shell casings and the bodies of German soldiers who had tried to storm their position. The Lost Battalion, as newspapers would call them, became instant heroes. They represented everything America wanted to believe about itself, that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, that ordinary men could perform extraordinary acts, that the melting pot of American society could forge warriors as tough as any in the world. President Wilson himself sent congratulations. Parades were held. But for the men who had survived those 5 days in hell, the celebration rang hollow. They had watched friends die slowly of wounds that could have been easily treated. They had held dying men in their arms, powerless to help. They had been forgotten by their own army, bombed by their own artillery, surrounded by enemies who wanted to kill them and a forest that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Major Whittlesey would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership, as would Captain McMurtry and several others. But the recognition brought Whittlesey no peace. In the years after the war, he was haunted by the decisions he had made, by the men who had died under his command. In 1921, just 3 years after the battle, he boarded a ship bound for Cuba and disappeared overboard. His body was never recovered. Those who knew him believed it was suicide, that the weight of those 5 days in the Argonne forest had finally become too much to bear. The hero who had saved nearly 200 men by refusing to surrender could not save himself from the memories of those he could not save. The story of the Lost Battalion endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and extremists. These were not elite troops or battle-hardened veterans. They were civilians in uniform, men who months earlier had been living ordinary lives in the tenements and factories of New York City. But when tested beyond any reasonable limit, when faced with a choice between surrender and almost certain death, they chose to stand and fight. They transformed a tactical blunder that should have ended in disaster into a testament to human endurance. Their 5 days in that ravine became a defining moment not just of World War I, but of American military history, a reminder that ordinary people, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary sacrifice.